Welcome to Inside AI, a podcast from the EPFL AI Center. I'm your host, Marcel Salathé, professor and co-director of the EPFL AI Center. Each episode brings you fascinating discussions with brilliant minds from EPFL and across the global AI community. From groundbreaking algorithms to ethical considerations, from technical innovations to real-world applications, we explore the technology that's transforming our world. Whether you're an AI researcher, industry professional, or simply curious about the technology that's shaping our future, join us as we venture inside AI. Today, I'm speaking with Daniel Huttenlocher. But before we do that, just a reminder about the upcoming Applied Machine Learning Days, AMLD 2025, on February 11th to 14th at the Swiss Tech Convention Center at EPFL in Switzerland. It's 3 days of conference, amazing keynotes, parallel tracks, and tons of networking on all kinds of aspects, from business applications, scientific insights, startups, and policy discussions, including also a fourth day for hands-on workshops. This is the most exciting time ever in AI, so join us for the 9th edition of AMLD at EPFL. Tickets and full program are available at 2025.appliedmldays.org. Now back to the conversation with Daniel Huttenlocher. Daniel is the inaugural dean of the MIT Schwarzman College of Computing and professor of computer science, joining in 2019. Before this role, he served as the founding dean and vice provost of Cornell Tech in New York City, where he led the development of academic programs and campus growth. He earned his PhD in computer science from MIT and has conducted research in computer vision and computational geometry. He has been a member of Amazon's board of directors since 2016 and co-authored The Age of AI and Our Human Future with Eric Schmidt and Henry Kissinger. Daniel recently received an honorary doctorate from EPFL. In this episode, we explore the broader implications of AI on society, its impact on the labor market, education, and the evolving relationship between technology and human progress. I hope you enjoy the conversation. So I have the privilege today of talking to Dan Huttenlocher. Dan, I will properly introduce you before, but just to repeat it again, and the context of this conversation, you're the dean of the Schwarzman College of Computing at MIT, and I have a number of questions about that. And you also wrote a book, a very interesting book on AI called The Age of AI with the late Henry Kissinger and Eric Schmidt, which most people know as the former Google CEO, but of course still extremely active in AI. So I want to dive right in, and there's a couple of very broad topics, so it's actually a bit hard to even find a good entry point, but maybe let's just start with a 30,000 feet societal question. So AI is obviously everywhere, it's continuing to grow. What's your take on AI's role in affecting society, both from the opportunities and potentially also the challenges in the coming, say, months and years?
Yep. I would start probably by saying that I think the most crucial thing about the continued march forward of AI, and I don't think it's a genie that goes back in the bottle, so to speak. So it's really up to all of us how this pans out. And this is one of the things that I think it's very important to educate people broadly about AI and its opportunities and its challenges. And in particular, there are two critical aspects. One is how AI ends up being developed, which is something that you see quite a bit of focus on in discussions about AI. But the other is how it's used, which actually we see much less focus on, and is at least as important, and is something that, frankly, anybody can educate themselves about, right? So developing AI that's done by experts, and it's a relatively small number of experts in any new kind of technology who are really pushing the forefront of that. But how we use AI is everybody. It's up to all of us, and we really need to learn more about it so that we can help shape it. So that's how I would preface it, and then I'm happy to talk more about that question. I think it's extremely important, but I would start from there.
Mm-hmm. So maybe we can, since you're making reference to a certain extent to education, maybe that's a good place to start. So what's your view there? I mean, I think I always think of this in sort of two dimensions. One is, of course, what we do as educators at universities, or more broadly in educational institutions. And then the other, since obviously only at any point in time a small fraction of the population is at an educational institution, the sort of continuous education, lifelong learning type of approach. How do you see that going forward? In particular, what advice would you give to educational institutions that are looking at this and are saying, this is extremely potentially confusing, right? Because of course we can teach about AI, that's not so much the issue, but it seems a lot of educators are concerned how AI sort of poses real challenges to how they teach, how students learn, how to assess students, and so on. How do you see this developing?
Yeah, so I think those are great questions, which I'll dig into in a second. One thing I want to say is I think outside any sort of formal education is also very important.
Yep.
I think that's why Kissinger and Schmidt and I got together to write the book, which is now, sort of ancient history AI time. It's 3 years ago, right? It's
exactly.
And so I think anybody who is, developing AI, thinking about how to, govern AI, deploying AI, really needs to be communicating and thinking about how to communicate to and engage with broader audiences. So I just preface it with that. I think for AI in the educational context, so I think there's two pieces. One is from a curricular point of view, what are we teaching where? And the other is, how does AI potentially affect pedagogy? And I'll start with the pedagogical one for a moment, because I think, again, it gets a fair amount of airplay, so to speak. I think there's a very useful analogy, which is a narrower analogy, so it only goes so far. But when electronic calculators first came out, the people in sort of mathematical and engineering disciplines just freaked out. Students were going to use it to cheat. They really weren't going to understand the fundamentals, because all of this hand calculation and use of slide rules and all of the things that we did to calculate in the 1970s and before were somehow critical to understanding. And I think that it's very important as educators that we really think about how this technology can help change how we educate and can help elevate how we educate. Because I think now when you look back at it, some 40 plus years later, invention of the electronic calculator, which of course was eventually replaced with just sort of general purpose computing and, spreadsheets and other tools. It's allowed us to teach much more because we're not focusing so much on the mechanics of calculation, but it has had to change how we sort of ground more theoretical material, right? So the more theoretical material used to be grounded in how you calculated it by hand, which was inherently very limiting. I think now we try to ground more theoretical material in, little bits of computer code to calculate, sort of other things other than like, here's just an equation and you have no idea how to solve it and get some kind of answer out of it. But it's, I think it's really enriched things. And I think exactly the same argument is what I think can be made and actually is the most likely outcome for AI. You know, I'm going to say something that some people might find annoying. You know, are all those sort of vapid essays that we ask students to write really the best way of learning? How do we really test people's learning? And I think, so of course that's with reference to, generative AI and AI chatbots that can now, write at least as vapid papers as students write on their own. And I think we do need to think about, again, what are we really trying to test with that? In particular with critical thinking skills, which is one piece of writing. I mean, I'm a firm believer that it's hard to understand most things if you can't have a cogent written explanation. If you're just talking about it, I don't think it tests your understanding very well. But of course, if you go back to sort of more Socratic methods of teaching that we don't really do today because they're very labor intensive, those are in many ways at least as good as, the written word for thinking things through. And I think generative AI potentially gives us, opportunity to think about how do we really scale some of those ways of teaching that we haven't used, often in centuries, if not longer. I don't think it's something that can be completely delegated to, an AI chatbot, but some amount of interactive probing of somebody's understanding by humans, together with AI, I think really revolutionize teaching in ways that frankly would be much more fundamental than getting calculation out of sort of the mathematical and engineering disciplines as a sort of hand calculation out. I think this really is a phenomenal opportunity if we approach it in the right way. So as you can tell, it's something I care a lot about. So you ask a short question and get a long answer, but I think the nuance is very important here.
Yeah. While you were talking, I was reminded of this paper that came out the other day. I think it was by UPenn, though I'm not entirely sure. And it had this slightly provocative title. I don't remember, but something like generative AI can hamper learning or something fairly, provocative. And I recall that they sort of used two groups. One was basically using vanilla GPT. And the other was one that was prompted to first have the answer already given so that it wouldn't, hallucinate. But also it was specifically asked to not just give the answer to the learner, but actually to help them reason themselves to the answer. And no surprise, that thing was substantially better when you were looking at learning outcomes than the vanilla one. So that's, I guess, to your point that this is going to be useful, but we have to sort of think a bit more deeply about how we want to use it to really leverage it, if I understood you correctly.
Absolutely. And I think, frankly, it has the opportunity to be better than learning outcomes from human teachers also.
Yeah.
Because, if you think about what we're really trying to do in teaching, it's to present some material that's, it's fun as a teacher to try to figure out how to present it better to get to a broader audience of people and people with different learning styles and so forth.
That's right.
But then we want to make sure that it's really something that's sort of, lodged in the brain, so to speak. And I think, our evaluative mechanisms now are pretty primitive.
Yeah.
Exams, written papers, and so, I mean, one of the things I'm not teaching these days because in a dean role, my schedule doesn't really permit it. But in the days when I taught regularly, if someone missed one of my exams or did particularly badly on it and wanted some kind of a makeup, I would offer them an oral makeup exam, and almost all of them would turn it down. That's not with my grade.
Because it's challenging.
It sort of shows people's, because I think somebody, who really is trafficking in material would be happy to do an oral exam at a board, because the back and forth, I think, is a very good way of uncovering understanding. understanding compared to you made some silly mistake on an exam and you get a bunch of points off. And so I think that we really need to think about how this technology could help us really gain more in-depth understanding of people's comprehension of material, and therefore raise their level of comprehension of material, because evaluating it in other ways. So but I think, when you said it, the provocative title about it can it can lower, I think a little bit that's, sort of a truism. I think that this technology, like many technologies, maybe most technologies, can make things better or make them worse. And so it's easy to point at cases where it's bad, like if somebody's just, working with something that hallucinates and doesn't, and they don't understand the material either, so they can't correct it, or they're just using the output without understanding it and turning it in as their own work. I mean, there's all kinds of, but the same technology, I think, if we're, structuring how we use it, offers amazing potential. And it's not just, I think the things I'm most excited about are in the sort of helping develop and evaluate critical thinking skills and understanding of material skills. There's a lot of sort of talk, chat tutors, and they're fine. I don't think that's going to change education in the same way of us really being able to be better at evaluating comprehension, which is what it's all about, right? It's not just presenting material, it's what did people get out of it. And I think that we can really change that.
Yeah. That seems like a generally good lens through which one can look at things and how AI impacts, fill in the blank. I mean, you were saying, I think multiple times now, that basically it allows students, right, to push further. We can sort of raise the bar in some sense also from what we're asking from the students. That's probably also, I mean, I would say that's probably a common effect. No, same thing in research. If people ask, what is AI going to do in research? My answer is usually, well, I don't quite know, because that's why it's still called research, but I think it's just going to very rapidly raise the bar. Do you look at this the same way?
Yeah, absolutely. And, there I think we're already seeing the sort of the tip iceberg, right? So, in biology and biological sciences, protein structure and function is central to many, many things. And on the protein structure side, I mean, of course, there was AlphaFold a few years ago, but there's also been very interesting, more recent developments with a number of techniques. Well, of course, the protein, I should say the protein structure folks, both Baker and his lab at UW and the AlphaFold folks who kind of, push the same technology or very similar technology forward simultaneously, knowing about each other, but independently. Now that was very focused on structure in the way that the protein structure problem had been formulated back in the 1970s. And that sort of came from crystallography, and then after that, cryography, which, was a little better than crystallography in terms, but it wasn't about a protein in any kind of natural state. It was about, some way of sort of fixing the structure and then trying to predict that fixed structure from just amino acid sequences. But what's happened more recently with the advent of large language models is work that's using sequence data to predict structure and various sort of functional things, like how these proteins mate with other proteins and so forth. And so that's a much more sort of functional notion of structure than I fixed it by deep freezing it or by forming a crystal. So So I think, this is an area where the continuing advances in machine learning are just, they already are completely transforming the biological sciences. And I think it's going to be just very hard to see the top of that change. I think it's going to,
That's right.
like if you look at things like, genomics and the effect it's had in the last 25 years, it's going to be much bigger. So, but the other thing I'd say is it's just that it's not alone. Like there's an incredible amount of machine learning advance in material science right now as well. And in chemical compound discovery and synthesis, including in the domain of drug development. So it just every one of these areas where the forefront of human knowledge is now so advanced that the next steps involve extremely complex systems that are very hard for humans to really get our head around. And so to have a sort of different form of intelligence in AI, to be able to sort of collaboratively, in some sense, look at these problems, not just with the human intelligence lens, but with some other form of intelligence, I think it's really going to just be revolutionary across the sciences and engineering. I'm very excited about that domain.
Yep. And that's an excitement that we share. So can you tell us a bit about that the Schwarzman College of Computing at MIT that you're the dean of? So can you share a bit what this is and what you're trying to do there, and how it's different from any other old college?
Yeah. So I want to preface this by saying that the idea of the college and the formation of the college predates my time in a leadership role at MIT. I almost said predates my time at MIT, but I was a graduate student here decades ago. And then left, got my degree and hightailed it out of town. And I think, already in the sort of 2018 timeframe when the college was announced, I got here in kind of just in the fall of 2019 semester. So it was, this was stuff that was at least a year before that. A number of leaders at MIT and, Mr. Schwarzman really saw that this sort of looming AI age was going to change everything. But it wasn't just that, right? It was also that we never really, in academia, I would argue, addressed the sort of need for computer science and other sort of computational expertise. We've always been playing catch up. And so if you think about, computer science, if you think about operations research, if you think about computational science and engineering, sort of numerical methods, statistics and data science, and all of these fields, for most of the last several decades, student demand outpaces the ability to serve the students. Companies need more of that expertise than we're producing. And increasingly that the most recent advances in those computational fields are relevant to research and development in essentially almost every field. Universities weren't really set up for that, right? So if you think about, I'll just, for the moment, focus on a, sort of technically oriented sort of science and engineering institution like MIT, but I think it applies much more broadly. So when you think about mathematics, it's infused with most disciplines at MIT. But the math that we use in most disciplines is if not decades, maybe even centuries old. And so it can sort of, diffuse in a sort of slow, natural way out of mathematics into other disciplines. Whereas the computing that people are using, the CS, the AI, the statistics, et cetera, because statistics has become a computational discipline, just to be clear, is often extremely new. And so you want some other way of facilitating that, both in the research enterprise of the university and in the teaching enterprise of the university. So that's really the mission of the college, is to really think about how do we approach computing as something where there's both the depth in the computing disciplines, extremely important. This is not just sort of cut across MIT, but there's also the infusion of that depth as, at the depth that's appropriate with every discipline across the institute. So that makes the college organizationally different than, I think, any college for the most part that's out there historically, and certainly different than the 5 schools at MIT, right? I mean, so schools and colleges normally are a collection of departments and programs that are, somewhat related. And here we have sort of this compound mission of some set of such departments and programs, but also with infusion of that forefront expertise across the institution. So we work really, well, certainly with every school, but with essentially almost every department at MIT, every department program, in faculty hiring, in enabling and helping support research that connects computing and other disciplines, in educational initiatives. So it's in many ways kind of a matrix-like structure. It cuts across the schools. And so maybe a way to clarify that is every faculty member who is affiliated with the college is not only in a department, which they would be, in a traditional school, they're also in a school. So it's not sort of another thing separate from the school structure at MIT. And so, the programs that we develop, the job of the leadership in my office is to, build and maintain close ties across the schools and across the departments. And at the same time, to be responsible for keeping MIT at the forefront of computing disciplines like, CS and AI and others.
Yep. No small feat, of course. Good.
I mean, look, organizational change is hard anywhere.
Yeah, exactly.
Often refer to institutional antibodies, right? I mean, it just institutions don't like to change.
Indeed.
But we're about 5 years in now, because I started in fall of 2019. I mean, COVID was a little bit of a wrench in the works there, but we still got a lot done in that time, actually. But now, we have really exciting new classes that it's pretty clear would not have happened without something like this to help facilitate them. We have hired close to 50 really amazing new faculty, many of whom are working at infusion, in infusing computing and other disciplines. Many of them are just sort of in core CS and AI also, of course. And a very important other part of the college is the connection of these advances in computing to the sort of social and ethical and policy dimensions of computing. It involves close collaborations with the humanities and social sciences here. We've hired faculty with a number of those departments. We've been developing educational initiatives with a number of those departments. So it's not just science and engineering, and that's extremely important. And that was really envisioned again before I got here. Again, to credit the original vision for the college was that the sort of broad ethical considerations were critical in computing generally, but particularly with the sort of growth in use of AI.
That's super interesting. So, I mean, maybe going back a little bit to the topic that we started in the beginning, I think there's a very clear vision of what's going to or what should happen in education, specifically in our sort of universe of universities and schools. But how do you think about the role of such institutions at bringing this knowledge to a broader population? I mean, we'll in a minute or so talk about also, of course, the future of work and so on. And I guess you are probably also not very worried about the prospects of MIT graduates. I'm not worried about the prospect of EPFL graduates. If I'm worried, I'm generally an optimist, but if I'm worried, I would take a much broader look and say, okay, what's going to happen to a lot of jobs that are going to disappear? Sure, they're going to change, but their skills need to change along with the jobs. And I don't see, at least here, a lot of discussion about that. So I'd be curious how you think about this.
Yeah. So I'll do them in order. So I'll start with the broader education question, and then come to the sort of work of the future type set of questions. Partly because I'm personally more engaged in and familiar with the education ones, so I'll start. I'm a little more comfortable. So I think there's a real need, as I said before, to try to give everybody some opportunity to learn more about this technology and its use, and be educated in how to try to help shape it. And most people don't get a college degree, much less a college degree from a top institution. So we really have to think about this much more broadly. And I think with all the excitement around sort of online education and MOOCs, that the massive online open courses, I think we've learned both the strengths and the limitations of purely online education. I think that it's great for autodidacts, for self-learners, for people who have that motivation and that background and that curiosity to really learn. But there are a lot of people who would like to learn but need more help than that. And I don't think they're well served by online. And we see it in the very, very high dropout rates from those sorts of programs, et cetera. So I think one of the key aspects for highly selective educational institutions is to really think about what's next beyond online. And that's something we're starting to talk about at MIT. We think that some form of hybrid programs is extremely important. And we're really thinking about how we can do that in ways that scale. So we're not, and again, there's a million MITs, right? I mean, like this institution is very much like 1,000 flowers bloom, and literally 1,000, because we have about 1,000 faculty. So, but there are a group of us who are really thinking about how to develop relatively scalable hybrid learning. So relatively scalable means the in-person component of this would not, in general, be taught by people from the MIT campus, right? I mean, be that, faculty and other teaching staff, or even our students, right? I mean, we're not big enough, even if you count everybody who's, in the educational enterprise on campus. So really thinking about how to do that, thinking about how the material and the pedagogical approaches change. But if you think about the combination of sort of online material, where I think we've learned a lot about sort of small segments and kind of regular evaluation interspersed with the small segments, not the sort of 50-minute lecture type thing. It's done on campuses. Um, we've learned a lot about that. I think the promise of more interactive types of engagement with generative AI and the human element in a classroom, which means a group of students together working on things, but also somebody in that room who has more expertise than the students, but is not necessarily like a professor at a major research institution. And so how do we, we're thinking about how we bring those things together in a way that can really scale. So I'm very excited about that as an experiment. I mean, just like the purely online stuff was an experiment, about 20 years ago now, in the sort of, that's when the internet clearly was a thing, as opposed to just like, and so I think that offers a big potential opportunity to scale a deeper level of learning, and we're excited about that. There are other groups at MIT who are doubling down on the online and using generative AI, and that's great. But what personally excites me is this other project. So I think we will see a number of mechanisms that can allow universities to scale their impact, which is important.
Yeah. And what
also important, oh, sorry, I was just saying, it's also important in doing that we think there are pedagogical issues, there are curricular issues here in addition to pedagogy. So I think that for some of this kind of education, it's important that we get closer to what the learners need immediately in their lives, for their jobs, for their career prospects, et cetera. We tend to think about, multi-year degrees and, teaching fundamentals that will be useful for a long time. I don't think we should give up on that. That's what major academic institutions stand for. But I think we have to think about curricula that have some of that and some much more hands-on, practical, I can use it in my job next week. Because that's what motivates many learners out there who are not going to multi-year programs. And so I think we have to kind of meet them halfway. That is my sense. Look, the things that are completely short-term, companies do a great job of that already, like certification in some particular software package or whatever. That's great. Companies have trainings. I think that, but I think there's a big opportunity space in bringing together that hands-on, immediately relevant with the broader principles.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So if you go beyond that time horizon, what are we actually preparing people for in the future? You are, of course, I think fully agree if you say, well, the basics, right, will remain the basics, and for good reason, so we shouldn't give up on that. And then there's the practical things that they can use right now. But I think we're always challenged to prepare people in the longer term as well. And we are, of course, increasingly confronted. This is not a new phenomenon, but the scale of everything and the speed of everything just makes it much more harder. That we used to have no clue what the world would like in 20, 30 years. Now, frankly, it's challenging to see beyond 5 years. So what are the skills we can possibly hope to teach people beyond the basics and beyond what they need right now?
So I think my answers would be fairly different for somebody in a multi-year residential program versus the kind of we were just talking about. Because I think if you do sort of scalable hybrid learning, if you do hybrid learning so it's really scalable, it's available to people in a continuing way. And so, you don't worry about even the 5-year time frame. If they need something more, they can, do some, module that, lasts a couple of months, and, they have to add few hours a week to their schedule and doing that for that time period. And then, so I think it changes education to, and, you know, and online offers that type of flexibility already. But as I said, I think it's limited in its in its ability to sort of teach the harder, more conceptual things and to teach the non-self-motivated learner. But I think in the residential programs, you know, MIT has long had this. I mean, mens et manus is the, you know, institutional motto from its, you know, minds and hands from its time of founding. And I think it's important for institutions like us not to lose the manus part. And I think there have always been, you know, very strong sort of maker, hacker type culture and elements at MIT that, you know, help us not lose it completely. But I think there, in many areas, there's definitely, you know, increased focus on, you know, how is that really fitting in the curricula overall. And I think that's a good thing, because I think the fundamentals last, but they need to be connected to and informed by practice at some level. And that doesn't have to be, you know, directly connected to a job tomorrow. But it can't be faculty who haven't done any practice in forever, not willing to pull up their sleeves and learn what today's practice is.
Yeah, for sure. So maybe segueing there a little bit into the broader, again, societal impacts, because that's one of the things, of course, that in a lot of discussions comes up. Ultimately, at least that's my experience. I'd be curious to hear yours. I mean, people obviously have concerns. They can be of geopolitical nature. We can talk about it. They can be of sometimes even philosophical nature. What does it mean to be human in the age of AI and so on? Misinformation. But I'm nevertheless always finding that the number one concern is ultimately the effect on the job. I mean, this sounds maybe a little bit mundane to us, but it actually isn't, right? For people's lives, of course, the job is very much a central part, if not the central part of what they spend their time on and how they think about themselves. So what is I mean, you can't have a perfect answer for this. I'm not expecting it, but what's the future of work like, broadly speaking? Should we prepare people for roles where AI is unlikely to make any massive inroads, which I think is hard to predict, or should we prepare more broadly for a sort of AI human collaboration mode? What's the best way to think about this?
Yeah, so I think those are two very important modes, both things where it's likely that humans will play a, you know, sort of central role for quite a long time. And you know, the other is very much the human AI collaboration, which I think is extremely important. I should say that, you know, we have a very strong group of faculty that sit across the Sloan School of Management, the economics department, and computer science, who look at it and work on these problems in a lot more depth than I understand them. I definitely spend some significant time with that group, including sort of, you know, some joint research projects, but you know, Daron Acemoglu and Simon Johnson, who just won the Nobel Prize in Economics last week, was it? Very recently, this year. You know, they have been looking for a long time, along with some other folks in economics and as I said, CS and Sloan. The effects of technology on work You know, the Nobel Prize more looked at sort of more historical technologies and work that they've done there, but they're very active in looking at sort of AI and an AI economy, and what to do there. So it's a big area of study at MIT, and something that we view institutionally as very important as well. I think, from my point of view as a technologist, I think that we've kind of had the wrong focus for the last 75 years in terms of how we assess what we want out of AI. And I understand how we got there, but I think we need to really jettison it. The Turing test or the imitation game or whatever you want to call it, Turing's original framing of how to think about machine versus human intelligence was about machines replicating human intelligence, right? Could you set things up so that, you couldn't tell if it was a human or a machine sort of behind the curtain, so to speak. And the thing about focusing on replication is that's also a focus on replacement. Because if you're replicating, but also it becomes a focus on sort of funny things like how good are you at sort of simulating humans, at sort of fooling people into thinking you're human, which is not like, why should that be an objective of a different kind of intelligence than human intelligence? So, and look, at the beginning, this technology was so primitive that, that was a good measure. But actually, at a very similar time to Turing, about 1960, there's a guy, J.C.R. Licklider, who posed a different measure, which was humans and machines together able to perform better on a task than either one alone, which is a subtly but extremely importantly different objective, but one that, look, understandably is much harder to test, especially at the time when machines can't do much of anything, which was definitely true in the 1950s and 60s. So I mean, it's clear why we went with the Turing view, but I think it really belongs in the rear view mirror at this point. And that's not really the case. Like, a lot of stuff still is just on, training and outperforming humans. If you look at all the, things that the, large language model providers and developers are doing there, it's sort of, how does this do on a, college entrance exam? How does it do it? Right? This is about simulating human behavior. I think we really need to move past that. That's where a lot of the value is going to be. And in fact, as we were talking about with science and other things, I mean, it's that collaboration that's going to be important, but we need to be working on other metrics that in general for the development of this technology other than replication. So that, I think, is super, super important, and speaks to how we're going to address this work of the future kind of set of questions. Because I think with that sort of focus, then it's also, I think we will get better outcomes overall, but we will also become clearer to think about the role of humans if we're explicitly thinking about, or the roles of humans, not a singular role. What are the kinds of things and the relative value of humans and machines in various kinds of tasks. But if we keep focusing just on replication, it's much harder to do that.
Yeah.
So I think we need to change the focus. Yeah. And I'm not the only one to say this. I mean, number of people have been sort of, saying and writing things about how the Turing test has outlived its usefulness. And, but I think this precision about what we really should do instead, which is, A plus B is greater than A or B. Very important.
Yeah. And definitely a point that's not much talked about, or not enough. Let's
Not
put it
enough.
like this. Yeah.
Yeah.
And if you think about it, I mean, what it makes me think that many of the problems we're currently discussing as being challenges posed by AI are exactly the kinds of sort of replacement types of challenges. I mean, you think about misinformation, pretending to be a human when you're not, impersonating someone. Well, then of course also on the job side, replacing the human job. I mean, almost any sort of challenges that we perceive in AI are exactly what you're pointing out, right? As that replacement, rather as this addition or multiplication of working together.
Well, anything where you are going to use AI where human judgment is important,
Yeah.
it's really critical to remember that human judgment is not just human intellect. There's a lot of other things that go into human judgment.
Mm-hmm.
And so you built this AI to be really good at simulating human judgment. Doesn't mean it is human judgment.
Mm-hmm.
And that's dangerous. Just
Yeah.
plain dangerous. It's, and while I think AI alignment is great, to the extent to which these systems don't do things that are, completely sort of antisocial or whatever from the human point of view, that's good. But it actually makes this problem worse because it makes them look even more like they have human judgment because
Mm-hmm.
they don't
Mm-hmm.
do things.
Yeah.
So we have to recognize very explicitly that it is not. It's a
Mm-hmm.
different, first of all, human judgment's not just human intellect. And secondly, this is not human intellect. It's a different form of intellect.
Yeah. And
So
how does one go about this? So there's I think there's multiple approaches one could take here from a governance perspective, also from a regulatory perspective. I mean, there's sort of the straightforward approach where you say no AI should ever pretend to be human without divulging that it is actually not. That seems straightforward. I guess could be hard to enforce, but it seems like a reasonable first step. But then, wouldn't you say there will also be tasks where we would actually have an interest of replacing the human decision making? I'm thinking, right, of sort of very repetitive rote decisions that somebody just needs to make, and it's just a huge bottleneck, and nobody really likes that because it requires no creativity whatsoever. It just requires looking at the data and mapping it to a bunch of different rules and then saying yes or no. Wouldn't we be better off replacing that decision making to a machine?
absolutely. But I just think we need to be deliberative about that.
Mm-hmm.
And there will certainly be tasks where the level of performance that we need can easily be met by a machine, just like in terms of lots of traditional machines and technology that don't involve AI. And that's important for long-term sort of societal productivity and advancement. It has all kinds of short-term challenges for the people who get displaced out of those roles. And by short-term, I don't mean short-term in their lifetime. Unfortunately, often, it can be a sort of permanent negative in an individual's employment situation and opportunities. But, if you look at the history of, say, industrialization, for example, a lot of disruption of things, but at the same time, overall increases in lifespan, healthy lifespan, all most kinds of measures of quality of life.
Yeah.
Not saying industrialization doesn't have its downsides, but I mean, but I think that clearly AI will be, and in some sense, from an societal perspective, should be used to replace some jobs that humans are currently doing. That just shouldn't be the sole focus, which is pretty much what it is.
Yeah, exactly.
Both because we're missing huge opportunities, but also because, many of the problem cases are sort of not recognizing that this technology should be used in, viewing it solely as a replication.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Their jobs where human judgment's not so important.
Yeah, indeed.
Where they're pretty repetitive. That's
Exactly.
it.
Well, we only have a few minutes left, and of course we could go on forever, but I want to be mindful of your time, and I want to just make one more rather big jump. But since you wrote this book with also Henry Kissinger, who's obviously one of the preeminent geopolitical strategists of his time, how has that shaped how you look at geopolitics in the age of AI? How do you see things go forward here in the next 5 to 10 years?
Yeah. I mean, one of the great things in my view about being a faculty member is, part of your job is to learn from other people, learn from your students, learn from colleagues, learn from other smart people you come across who know more about something than you know. So it's writing the book was one maybe particularly visible piece of that. And of course, I'll preface this with, everything I learned is like a footnote compared to what real geopolitical strategists know and think about. But I do think that because of this sort of fundamental set of changes in AI and how it's used, it is going to change geopolitical strategy and and military doctrine in ways that are going to be fundamental, and that it's very hard to predict right now. So I guess one analogy I would make is to the period before World War I. Is in some sense, and this was sort of things I learned much more, I took, some Western history class, when I was in college, but that I learned much more in the kind of connections to what we're seeing today and working on the book. In many ways, like World War I shouldn't have been a big conflagration. But what had happened was that with industrialization, a bunch of the underlying sort of technologies that were relevant to the sort of intensity of warfare and the speed of warfare had completely changed the nature of conflict. But it wasn't really recognized at the time.
Mm.
And it certainly wasn't part of the sort of diplomatic ways of thinking about how to, avoid conflict. So, I mean, it's still true today, but industrialization made a huge change. I mean, getting troops and materiel to the front lines is a problem. The logistics of war is a big part of conflict. But the development of railroads and the ability to literally lay tracks across the countryside and move large amounts of troops and weaponry and ordnance and so forth turned something that with horses and wagons and so forth would have been a very slow to develop conflict into something that happened much more rapidly than anybody expected, sort of in terms of history and diplomatically. And I think that we're in an analogous era right now. I think the use of AI in everything from logistics planning to intelligent weapon systems. It's fundamentally changing the calculus of conflict. And I don't think we understand it. And unfortunately, I think it's not easy to get enough attention on understanding it until something goes wrong. Hopefully not at scale of World War I and the modern day equivalent. But that is certainly something that I think is very important. I have had the sort of privilege of spending time with some US defense and NATO leaders, just on some AI education, sort of professional education things that we've been doing at MIT. This is on the minds of at least Western military leaders. They know about this is not a surprise to them, so that's a good thing. But I think the further you get into sort of the broad-based sort of geopolitical decision making, I think it gets less and less appreciated, and these tend to be political decisions, maybe more than military ones. And so I think that that's just an area we need to really be attentive to. And whenever I have the opportunity to talk to senior government decision makers, if anything comes up about geopolitics, I try to root it in something concrete like that.
Yeah.
So I think that that's just a place we really need to be spending time.
Yeah.
But of course, it's also going to have vast implications for the world order in terms of sort of economic and soft power, not just sort of the military and potential conflict and defense side of things. And that's, again, something we don't understand very well, but I would say countries and regions that are not sort of actively working on how they can have an edge in an AI age are likely not to have an edge in an AI age. And that I think will diminish their impact in the world going forward. So I think it's a very important set of issues for countries to be focused on, and for regions and for alliances to be focused on.
Yeah. And just to remind everyone who's listening or watching, so as I mentioned at the beginning, you are the author of this book, The Age of AI, which, as you said, you published in prehistoric times of AI in 2021. Are you planning a second edition by any chance, or not in the making at the moment?
No, not. I mean, certainly it couldn't be the same three authors because Dr. Kissinger has passed away. But I think that was a sort of a book of the moment. There are parts of that book that are still remarkably relevant today.
Absolutely.
It was 3 years ago, and 3 years ago it was published, and that that means the writing was more like 4 years ago. But I think there are other important things that I hope to have the time again. The COVID pandemic sort of created a magic piece of time also, because suddenly travel, which uses up a lot of time, was out of all of our schedules. I don't think the three of us would have been able to really put the time in to write a book together without that. So, but I do think the sort of co-authorship of books that try to aim to have a broader, reach a broader audience about AI, and that are co-authorship with people who have really different kind of understanding than I do, is something I would look forward to doing again. But I think it's probably after I'm done being a dean leading a new college at MIT, which is a day job that uses a lot of my cycles.
A lot of time. Well, speaking of time, we are running out of it, and I'm deeply grateful for yours. So thank you very much for this conversation. I mean, I think we are just scratching the surface of what is going to be the conversation of probably our lifetimes. And again, I would point people who are interested in your thinking. I mean, apart from finding you in various places online, we'll continue to point them to the book, which is a great book. And should maybe also remind the listeners, and I forgot to mention that you were just recently visiting us because you got an honorary doctorate from EPFL. So congratulations on that again.
Thank you. Well, I'm deeply honored by that honorary doctorate. EPFL is an institution that I've long had deep respect for. I've spent time there when I've been on sabbaticals and had other little holes in my calendar over the decades.
Yeah.
And it's you know, it's one of the great academic institutions in the world. So it's a real privilege to be a degree holder now. I won't say a graduate. I didn't do the work for it, but I'll say a degree holder.
Sure. Yeah, no, well deserved. Good. Well, thank you so much. And yeah, talk maybe another time.
Yeah. Well, thanks for your wonderful questions and the terrific conversation.